Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space. Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Dan and Anand here, and we've got an absolute treat in store for you. We're diving into a feature from our recent LinkedIn Live session. We were joined by e-commerce veterans Rick Watson and Nate Skiver. Both have been around the e-commerce block for over 2 decades each, and they brought some serious wisdom to the table. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's dive headfirst into the e-commerce peak season 2023 roundtable.
Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
All right, so we'll let you guys kind of slowly filter in. This is going to be recorded as well, so we're going to turn this into an Ecom Logistics podcast episode with our returning guests, Rick Watson and Nate Skiver. I'm going to do a quick round of intros and then leave you in these gentlemen's good hands. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you can leave in the comments where you're joining us from today, and also one thing that you want to get out of the session today. You have experts who have technology background, operations, parcel, e-commerce. Like, these are veterans who know it all. So please, ask all of your deepest, darkest questions here, and these guys can help answer them. So I'll do a quick intro for everyone that's joining. We have Rick Watson here from Watson Weekly. If you are not listening to his podcast, that's a huge miss. I recommend it should be in your Monday podcast listening schedule. Rick founded RMW Commerce Consulting, and he also has a really amazing community, again, talking a lot about e-commerce and supply chain. Highly recommend joining that one as well. We also have Nate Skiver. He is an exceptional pro and talks about parcel transportation and e-commerce delivery on LinkedIn. So if you are not following him, that's, again, a huge miss. Please make sure you do. He has been in this space for over 20 years and talks at length about delivery expectations. He also has been featured by multiple publications and is constantly bringing us lots of good insights. And last but not the least, we also have Anand and Dan. I suspect you guys have probably heard them on the Ecom Logistics podcast. Anand is... He's our supply chain tech expert, and he has over 20 years of experience in this space as well, has gone through multiple implementations, peak seasons, all of the, good, bad, uglies that you can imagine. So feel free to ask him any of your tech questions. And then we also have Dan Call. He's the other co-host of Ecom Logistics podcast, has been in this space for... Dan, what did I say? 30 years-ish?
Oh, not yet. Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
Creeping up on it.
Dan has lots of experience, especially in the 3PL space, having founded, sold, and been part of multiple organizations, big and small. So again, he can really shed a lot of light on any of your operational problems, any questions that you have around that. And also, if any of you are attending Parcel Forum next week, Dan is going to be speaking there as well. So make sure you connect with him in person. All right. I will now hand it over to you guys to take over. Welcome, everyone. And again, don't forget to leave us comments throughout this presentation in terms of any questions you have, any doubts, anything you want to clarify, and we'll surface them up to Dan and Anand and Rick and Nate as we go through the session. Welcome.
Welcome.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
You. Yeah. Thank you, Harshita, for that. That's awesome introductions, and so great to be here with our friends in the industry. And, as I was thinking about, now Harshita said I was, 30 years in the industry, so not quite that long, but getting there. And I was thinking back like on my last, my first 15 peak seasons, and, they were fairly predictable. It's definitely not easy, but generally speaking, if you had a good plan, and you executed that plan really well, that would lead to success. And I don't think that's anything compared to what brands, retailers, and 3PLs face today with all the complexity, planning, and preparation that's required for success. So I thought it'd be cool if we kind of maybe all started with a glimpse into real life peak season scar tissue, and maybe you guys could all share some horror stories you've had from previous peak season events. Dinah, do you want to go first?
I can definitely give you one. Redundancy planning. I don't think, and again, I'm talking about big retail redundancy planning and what happens when basically your servers go down, right? And you are in an operational backlog that you will essentially never catch up on. And that's something, so I won't name names, right? But it's an experience that I've lived through. Literally the day off peak, right? Like as the volumes coming in, Black Friday volume starting to hit us, we are processing and no redundancy from a data backup standpoint, and the system basically goes down. And we brought it back up in about 6 hours, and then operations started going, but we had lost enough time and there was enough bleeding that ended up happening. And I'll tell you, since then, every single site I've been involved in, having, even if it's a one pager, even if it's a few hours of like sitting and having a conversation about disaster recovery and business continuity. If something happens, I mean, you won't believe the amount of times I've actually sat through and, built a plan for like earthquakes, right? And it's like, it's not going to happen, right? Like it's like, but still,
yeah. Until it happens.
Until it happens, exactly. So, just having that in the peripheral, we depend too much on systems, and systems are what's going to run things forward, right? But having the plans and ensuring that you have enough redundancy, and it's something that I've faced. Again, I can't name the client, but yeah.
How about yourself, Rick?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it depends on what kind of direction you're coming from. From a system perspective, I think you can never rely too much on one system because systems have points of failure. And as a former developer, kind of seeking out those single points of failure within your application, whether they're the database or the load balancer or the authentication or a specific machine that is the only one that's running this one thing. These things will happen when the server reboots and one process that controls all the other processes doesn't start up. So I think, look, the game is won actually before peak, and the game is won in preparation. And it has to do with scenario planning. It has to do with practice. I do think that drilling peak is important, and especially if you have technology systems, making sure that comes as no surprise that this amount of volume or if this server gets unplugged, that the entire operation is still running. I'll kind of pause here for a second and let Nate go, but there's a lot more I can sort of keep going on.
Absolutely.
That's kind of the starting point is drilling and the game is won in the initial preparation.
Yeah, and to build on really Rick and Ninad, what you shared as well, just somewhat from a systems technology standpoint. So that's not really my background on the retail side, but I did have a cup of coffee in e-commerce, and it was at least tech related. I'll just call it that. And so generally speaking, it's not a great idea to have an implementation butting up against peak. Say, I don't know, Sterling OMS and Manhattan at the same time in September. Not the best idea, but I was part of the team that was trying to execute that. That didn't go too poorly. It actually went all right in September, but maybe there wasn't enough stress testing, a few other things. Long story short, in December, happened to find that about 15,000 orders weren't upgraded as part of the holiday upgrades that everybody is known to know and love. And so we could have tested better. We did catch it early. Over half of those orders still got to the customer by Christmas, but half didn't. So call it $8,000. 8,000 customers weren't happy. There was a plan in place, unfortunately, for mass appeasements for customers. So that one was used from the playbook. But it is just another illustration, I think, of needing to plan, needing to test, but then also being able to rely on the people involved, how they communicate to at least do damage control. And that was the end result, but wasn't fun to go through that and communicate internally to a few executives that weren't too happy about it.
Yeah. And by the way, Nate, right, like the industry actually does think bumping up against all the way into September, like I'm talking big retail, because brands have a different perspective. And there's like learnings from the large retail and large CPG type organizations, right? And you kind of see where most implementations do always get pushed to September. And one of the things that I've learned is don't plan to implement in September, because you're going to be in a last minute crunch. Projects get delayed unless you have a superb team and a superb, like a project manager. The chances are that it's going to end up getting delayed. And then because there is this hard deadline of peak, block that you need to put in place, you are now rushing things through. That will cause more problems in your peak, right? Like, so if you're doing systems implementation, you probably want to like get it done by the summer. Your project plan should say it should be done. And yeah, now you have a little bit of slack. Don't say that to the team that's working on it, but at least you have a little bit of slack to work towards.
Agreed. That would have been nice had that happened, but not the case. So
yeah.
And I'll just add my some scar tissue. And again, most of my experience is in the 3PL life world. And, as a e-commerce fulfillment service provider, you're very reliant on the forecasts that your clients have. So I remember, one peak season, I was excited because we had this new client. They were expecting, enormous volume, and it was a puppy popper popcorn machine, right? And it was supposed to be like the new craze and everything, and ended up selling about 1% of the volume they expected. And it just locked down our operation because we had containers full of this inventory that just caused everything else to get jammed up. So, as it relates to technology and everything else and that planning and preparation, I mean, honing in on a realistic forecast is so important for the success of what happens in the four walls.
Absolutely.
I'd love to maybe now pivot and just talk about your thoughts on, what the audience could start thinking about preparing for. Again, that preparation should have happened starting in January after the last peak season. But I was recently looking at CNBC did a 2023 Retailers Outlook supply chain survey, and they came back with some stats that would love everyone's thoughts and opinions on. And the three takeaways were about 71% of consumers will cut back on holiday spending. 67% expect consumer spending to be heavily influenced by promotions and heavy discounts. I mean, I think that's pretty common throughout the past seasons. And the collective majority of those surveyed were expecting similar volume as last peak season or slightly lower. So, maybe starting with you, Nate, your perspective on that survey and what you're hearing in the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the survey results, I mean, it's similar to what I'm hearing. Also, of course, where I've read elsewhere, and I immediately start to jump to packages and carriers and what that might look like, and year to date, package volume in the market is down, and with the uncertainty around demand, it starts to Dan, you mentioned forecasting. That's key. Just generally speaking, with retailers, package carriers, retailers aren't the best forecasters to begin with. It's hard. And then you have uncertainty around the demand. It becomes even harder for the carriers to plan. And so right now, I don't think it's like in the, say, 2021, it was just expected that there was going to be a significant amount of volume. Last year, I think the expectation was pretty muted, and it kind of materialized that way. I think it's somewhat that way now, but there's more of a concern that will the volume materialize so that we have both on the labor front of fulfillment, but then package carriers. They've been trying to plan their resources better, more tightly. And now we're not certain really when that demand's going to hit. So is it going to be a little bit pulled forward into the first part of Q4? When will consumers buy from which channel? What will that look like? So that all factors into the packages, when they'll materialize, and it's hard to predict that. And so I think that's where retailers and carriers are trying to get the best forecast together. And it's September, but it's not. I don't think it's real clear yet.
So you're saying like peak is shifting, right? Like essentially people like the sales are coming on earlier. Peak is not what it used to be pre-pandemic. It seems like the behavior patterns definitely changed, and we still haven't settled on what that pattern happens to be, right? Like it's more spread out rather than the big bumps. Of course, the bumps are going to be there.
I mean, to an extent, although I still think it's not determined how much consumers will buy, just based on, like you mentioned, as part of the feedback, right? Of discounting and promotions. Of do you run that? Let's say to compete with Amazon, Target, Walmart running the promotions in October. How much do you glean from that? And then is there still the large bump, relatively speaking, in Cyber 5? I would expect there to be, but big as in flat to last year, or up 5% or down 5%. So that I think I don't think the distribution across the quarter would be that much different than last year. It's just the aggregate amount of what that will be, I think, is still in question.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I just to pile on top of Nate for a second, I tend to agree that's the distribution, and it's almost like we have a tale of two sets of voices. You have the economists that are telling us that the economy has never been better and we're going to have a soft landing and recession is out of the picture. And then you have the retailers are wondering, like, where's the traffic? And where's the revenue? And every single brand and retailer I'm talking to is making it up on operational costs. They're trying to reduce their shipping costs. They're trying to reduce their cloud spend. They're trying to reduce their employer costs to make up for basically gross profit shortfalls writ large, whether that's a revenue shortfall or like an AOV shortfall or a conversion rate shortfall or a unit shortfall. And so everyone's trying to make up for those changes. And even in the retail earnings, it's all over the map. There's no pattern to it, because I think the only pattern that I can detect is that generally the premium like retailers of mass market goods are being hurt because consumers aren't wanting to pay a premium for almost anything.
Yeah.
If your product is extremely valued and the consumer does not view it as replaceable, then you're in good shape. In a lot of cases, and I think that's helped a lot of companies in beauty, and even some brands that are executing well, like Abercrombie and Fitch the last quarter, that you might not normally think are like, oh, I thought apparel was down. Well, yeah, if you talk about Macy's, that no one's walking in the door of, but not necessarily a brand like Lululemon that people are interested in,
right?
In buying.
Yeah, I think that's words of wisdom from Rick Watson once again. And yeah, the uncertainty is, you think about, a lot of our audience too, they're in that operational distribution, technology support part of the business. And yeah, when you're always looking for ways to cut on that, the customer experience is still as strong as it's ever been, and the want for fast and free and quick delivery is not going anywhere. So completely agree. I think we've got some amazing questions actually already coming in from the audience. So I want to kind of start tackling those as we have time. One would be, it'd be interesting to hear everyone's thoughts about the additional capacity on small parcel, and will that change the peak experience this year? And I think we could parlay that, and maybe Nate, you could start running with it. Some of it is relating to, like, obviously UPS and them getting the agreement finalized, but there was a lot of retailers kind of looking for alternative plans and alternative carrier solutions. So maybe your just overall view of what small parcel will look like, and are there any capacity concerns with the major carriers this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think somewhat similar to last year, or building off of last peak, is that with the soft volume throughout and in this year, and the carriers have been able to make adjustments along the way, you also then have FedEx, who is in a much broader kind of macro scale, cutting costs and resources. But carriers are in a good position from a capacity standpoint. There's not a capacity constraint or crunch. It's managing it very, very closely and tightly to the demand that nobody is sure is going to materialize. And so from a shipper standpoint, I actually think it should be a favorable situation of transit times, capacity, service reliability. Really, if you mentioned some finding alternatives, and that has kind of been a theme sometimes to supplement UPS and FedEx over the last couple of years. And then the UPS labor situation did facilitate more retailers finding, additional carriers to add. But now in peak, you also then have to consider, if that additional carrier or other one wasn't just, say, FedEx, then do you have enough volume for all the carriers you have now? So in some ways, capacity itself, I don't see being a constraint or challenge, but allocating the volume and managing it between carriers might be kind of the other direction, because UPS and FedEx, they expect the volume that you forecast to provide them. And so that actually is a little bit of a challenge. Other thing real quick, just along the same lines though, is the cost, which has been mentioned in a couple of comments, just cost pressure. Relatively speaking, it's at least in a better situation this peak season in being able to already have negotiated some better concessions on, say, peak surcharges, things like that. Or if those negotiations are going on now, it's a more favorable environment for the shipper than it has been in quite a long time. So there's always additional expense. It doesn't net go down necessarily, but it's not going to be maybe as severe.
That's awesome. What are your thoughts, Rick?
Yeah. So in terms of peak, I think it goes down to the comments you made earlier, Dan, about forecasting. And it's not, if you kind of read the idea of constraints, we've removed capacity as a constraint in the system right now. And so the constraint moves upstream. The constraint moves to, do you have the right stock on hand? And so I think out of stocks are going to be a big challenge. I think a lot of retailers are trying to play it very cute right now. And with, they're not reordering as much. As a result, container and freight volumes have kind of lagged, and they're trying to sell off inventory that they've had in the overstock. Now you're going to, in holiday period, they could be caught flat-footed in those situations. And so I think capacity on the small parcel side is probably not going to be most people's consideration. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see some out of stocks this holiday, especially if there's some good, improper forecasting going on. because CFOs have been tightening their belts a lot. And I think they're more worried about giving away margin than capturing margin, like the extra gross profit dollars that might come from additional units. They're not chasing the unit volumes. And so I think this year that I wouldn't be surprised to see some stories about large retailers being affected by that.
Rick, I'll second that on particularly given, right, like the way supply chain and the forecasting side of things actually end up working, right? The delay lag time, because it's not all just in time. The delay lag time on reordering and being able to get the products happens to be, a 3 to 6 month cycle is what you're kind of working towards. And if you kind of play back, the economists today are saying things are looking good. And maybe people are ready to spend this peak. But the problem is going to be the decisions were made 6 months ago. And I remember 6 months ago, even thinking about our own business, there was an environment of fear that things are not looking really good. So, start taking, certain steps back, and maybe we don't need to order as much. And yes, there is all of this overstock inventory that I need to get rid of. And now the environment's shifting, and you're going to see that. And we saw that. And, not to switch subjects, but even on the technology side of things, a lot of investments, the amount of commitments to actually doing new software or doing upgrades that were being made in Q1 or Q4 of last year, we saw those projects go on hold. And then all of a sudden, everyone's like, oh, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that bad. Let's now go. So you are seeing this flood of projects out in the market. But it's okay to delay those decisions. I think the challenge with procurement and planning is probably going to hit us a little bit this year, and stock out conditions and assortments not going to be as interesting and all of that stuff. So it's just weird times, brother.
Yeah. I think one of the things that just, rang in my mind as you were talking to, Rick, is you're seeing a lot of retailers now start to really look at, what comes right after peak season, right? The influx of returns. And you're starting to see, Amazon has done it, right? I mean, really hard to return something after 30 days or near impossible. And you're starting to see retailers really kind of look at still making returns easy, but limiting the length of time you have to make a return, or what that return looks like, as whether it's stored credit or full refund. So that's another area that, again, is right around the corner for all of us after towards the tail end of peak, and certainly in Q1. What are you guys hearing from your clients or from the folks you're talking to on that front?
Rick, if you want to take that one, I just got a brief thought. Thank you.
On the return side, I think I was looking at the news this morning, and it seems like Amazon is being sued for not properly disclosing fees on returns. And so I think, returns I think have gotten harder for consumers in the past couple of years, and even more. It's not the cost of entry for direct-to-consumer e-commerce anymore to have free returns. And so they're either getting rid of the return problem altogether by having a wholesale relationship with the retailer, or they're having the returns go to stores and getting out of that D2C only strategy. So I think, if you just look at Amazon, returns cost $6 to $8 if you want to return to them directly now. Yeah. You can't just drop it by the UPS store anymore. Right. Exactly. And so who gets upset by that is the consumer. The consumer doesn't realize, they still remember the returns promise you gave a year ago or 2 years ago. And so I think it goes back to planning a little bit, making sure that if you've changed your returns policies in the last year or two, ensure that you're re-educating your consumer prior to the holiday, before they make the purchase to begin with, that that something's different now, and maybe the gravy train is over. And try to do that in a nice way that doesn't diminish sales if you can.
I don't know, that kind of makes me uncomfortable, because I'm as a consumer, I'm so used to free returns. The fact that it's going away, those days are over. Like I'm still not willing to accept that as reality. Let's just say. So yeah, but you're seeing that pattern change for sure. I mean, it's all about hitting that bottom line, trying to figure out where you can find the savings.
And this is just a hypothesis to throw out there. So I'm wondering from the consumer side too, though, is with return policies being stricter, more difficult to return items or more expensive, is if there might be, as far as buying gifts for others, a little bit of a shift or an impact with gift cards. Actually, more gift cards purchased during the holidays than actual merchandise and items from some of these retailers. And again, I start to think about package volume and then things like that. So that's another thing possibly that it won't be fleshed out in actual broad retail numbers, but that could impact available package volume. So I could see where just getting gift cards as opposed to purchasing something that somebody might need to return anyway. But that's not me. I'm not really much of a consumer myself, but I could see where that might be the case.
Yeah, this might benefit the big retailers again in that case.
Exactly. Right? Yep.
Yeah. Very interesting point. All right, we're getting some awesome questions from the audience. So want to pick up on one of those right now. From an omni-channel retailer's viewpoint, should they switch off ship from store to home and reserve store inventory for in-store customers and BOPUS plus BOPUS, buy online, pick up in store? Any perspectives on that?
I don't know necessarily about switching it off, but normally, well, again, this also comes down to forecasting the demand, but in where your inventory is placed and the accuracy of that inventory, especially in store. But you do need to be more conservative operationally during peak season. You're much more likely to have, well, hopefully, I guess, spikes in demand. More careful, even at the SKU level, to make sure that you're not exposing inventory that is part of a promotion that you might sell through too quickly. So I would say being appropriately conservative on the inventory that's available to ship from store. At the same time, margin obviously that's a big consideration too overall. And so I don't know of a lot of retailers who are uber efficient with ship from store. I mean, it's just not inherently that efficient. So if you really execute it well, then maybe you can be a bit more liberal with ship from store, but most aren't. So I would say conservative would be best.
Yeah, you saved the best comment for the end, Nate, because I think there are a few retailers in the US and in the world even that are really great at ship from store. We can probably name them on less than one hand. If less than 50% of your digital orders are shipped from store, then you should probably be very careful in what you're offering, and even consider being okay with the gig workers there, because the key for a buyer from ship to store, if they want something immediately and they can't wait for it, is the communication, especially if there's going to be an out of stock. The nice thing about a personal shopper is the substitution process. If you don't want item A, I can accept replacements, item B, C, and D. But I think that becomes more and more necessary the less accurate your inventory is. Mm-hmm. And most people's store inventory is not very accurate, particularly during peak season when shelves are a disaster. which kind of gets back to the point. If you're picking from your shelves, then you're kind of doing it wrong from a store ship to home point of view, from a world-class point of view. Not that's obviously you can start there, and I think everyone starts there, but that's not where your destination is.
Yeah. And as we look at peak as well, I completely agree, right? On the front, like, don't pick from your shelf, please. Like, just that's a bad strategy, right? Like, that's not a warehouse. Yeah, make sure you have enough, room in your back office to be able to kind of execute on that. And it also depends on the type of retailer or brand that you happen to be, right? Like, are you a general merchandiser? Are you an apparel? Or are you like a nutraceutical company, right? Like GNC as a company does really well ship from store, right? Like, as an example, right? But then you have companies like some of the larger apparel brands that struggle because the employee pool that you have working in those places are really not designed to be pickers, right? Like they are there for a purpose. And there have been few people that have been vocal about that it works in certain spaces and it doesn't work in the others. So, yeah.
I could have, so this is making me think, we don't have enough time, but I could have shared horror stories, kind of the scars of peak season based on ship from store only earlier. But I followed associates around to observe the process, walking the floor literally to spend 10 minutes to find 2 items. So this is apparel, but that and dozens of packages that just seem to not make it onto a carrier's truck for a day or 15 days. So.
Awesome guys. So many good questions. I'm just going to start picking from them, and I'm sure we'll have time to get to most or all of them. So from Nathan, I believe it's Nathan, from a 3PL order fulfillment standpoint, due to an increased order volume during peak, a trade-off has to be made between agreeing to the fulfillment SLAs or grouping pick tasks by denying the SLAs to reduce the pick path and improving picking efficiency. Would love to hear your thoughts on how to find a balance.
I'll go at it. I don't think it's either or, right? Like it's you can still group your pick task and still meet your SLAs. It's more about planning, right? Like so from an SLA perspective, first of all, you need to have a ceiling. So if you are a 3PL or if you are a brand that works with a 3PL, we haven't discussed this at this point, but making sure that you have good third-party coordination with your 3PL, with your transportation companies, with whoever that you are working within the ecosystem and having a very clear, concise conversation. I know Dan gave that one example about like 1% of the volume showed up. But in most cases, that's not actually what's going to end up happening, right? You have a kind of general understanding of where it's going to be, working very early with the 3PLs, saying, this is what the expectation of volume is going to be. And the 3PL then responding back and saying, listen, I will be able to manage X based on what you are providing. And it's a negotiation at that point to say, this is the commitment I'm making. If you are doing 2,000 orders a day on an average day throughout the year, you can't be expecting your 3PL to be able to fulfill 15,000 all of a sudden for your peak season, right? But it would be reasonable to say 8,000 is what's going to be expected, or 10,000 is what's going to be expected, and agreeing on that. So shifting your SLAs for peak, and then also agreeing on what is the new SLA for the things that fall off, right? So what's going to be the cycle time to be able to complete that? At that point, and this conversation kind of intertwines a little bit, but at that point, the 3PL's got to have good planning from a labor standpoint, that this is the expectation, and also a good understanding with the brand to say, listen, if this volume threshold goes below 6,000, we agree to 8,000, I'm going to be sitting on a lot of extra labor, right? And making sure that there is a mutual understanding between the two organizations, right? And I think establishing those will set you up for success. And as far as systems is concerned, I think it's critical that that I got to do a 8,000 order a day. Your picking strategies, most modern WMSs now come with profile switching. where you say, this is my non-peak profile and here's my peak profile for how I want to execute my warehouse flow, right? Like sometimes chaos works to your advantage during peak. If you really take advantage of that chaos from a picking standpoint. And so rather than doing more discrete picks, now you are actually doing, chaotic picks that are actually doing consolidation in a put wall as an example. So there is harness chaos. It actually does work in your favor, but it all comes down to planning. So as a 3PL or as a retailer, whoever you are, agreeing, and even if you're running your own warehouse, to say, what is my peak threshold that I'm going to be expecting out of my operations, and systems preparation and labor preparation for that is the key to that. So hopefully I answered that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with absolutely everything. And, one of the primary reasons why a brand or retailer goes the path of finding a 3PL partner is for the scalability that they could provide. And the reality is you could be a great 3PL partner 10 and a half, 11 months of the year, but there's a reason why Q1 is the heaviest time in the market for brands and retailers finding a new 3PL. And that's because everything that Anand just said doesn't always translate to reality. And a lot of that communication and planning doesn't take place. So just emphasize what you said. And the reason why we see so many brands, retailers looking for their next or a new 3PL, coming out of peak season is because of a failure to do a lot of the things you just mentioned.
Yeah. Spend time with your 3PL, spend time understanding communication channels. I mean, your account manager or even the 3PL owner should be on a speed dial text with you as friends, right? Like you should be sharing memes with these individuals, right? Like that's how close you want them to be, because there will be a time when you might need them to pull a favor where you are doing 2,000 and tomorrow all of a sudden you forgot and it needs to be 8,000 orders a day that needs to be executed. If you have that relationship, they'll work hard enough to actually make it happen. And you as a 3PL would do that if you have that level of relationship as well. I think the entire 3PL space is straight up relations. And it's beating them up doesn't get anyone anywhere. And I see that way too often is beating up your 3PLs. And then eventually, if you don't like it, move on, find a new one. But yeah.
Every 3PL is equally bad if you don't define the goalposts.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a huge proponent of documenting expectations, and not only for non-peak and peak in terms of throughput, but also things like goals, escalation, communication paths. I think escalation is also, like, in particular, I want to go back to this one for a second. Do you have escalation contacts at all your suppliers in your virtual inventory positions? Because not everyone is going to stock everything. We're talking a lot about 3PLs, but every one of your suppliers has stock, and some of them are virtual inventory relationships. And so those are critical things during peak season as well that we haven't discussed. And for all the technology and systems, the EDI could be flowing and the orders could be flowing, but if there's no one on the other end delivering, then SneakerNet is going to take over, and you need to get on the phone with people and you need to know who you need to talk to get something done. And they need to know if the escalation path and the SLAs for the escalation path, it's not, people think SLAs, fulfillment SLAs to the consumer, but your supply chain goes backwards, not just forwards. And backwards to your suppliers. I think that supply chain and the SLAs are also critical to document and to literally have a conversation with those relationships in advance. Send them a supplier cheat sheet. These are who to talk to on my end. This is the list of names I have on your side. Is this the right list of names? I'm going to call this person after 3 hours if I haven't heard from you. Is that okay with you? Like these things, you have to be, I think, the more specific you can be, the better. And maybe I got off on a rant here, but I think there's like just a lot of scar tissue coming out on the webinar here.
Nate, any thoughts on that?
I think you guys covered it. I think
Awesome. All right. Do we want to post up a next question here? There we go. From our buddy Tony Tavares, the one and only. What innovations or strategies for the labor market challenges of peak season 2023 are you most excited for? 50 to 80% temp worker scale in peak doesn't work in many of the major hub cities. Anybody want to tackle that first? I think we might have lost Nanad as well. He was dialing in from a client in Costa Rica, so we'll see if we can get him back on.
Maybe we need a labor market strategy for Nanad.
Yeah. Great. Technical issues. So, I mean, what I could give some past experience too, where, again, the adoption of automation and robotics, again, when everything we've been talking about is executed, right? So we've got a clear plan and we could execute a strategy on that plan. Just one example that comes to mind is the adoption of RAS, right? Robots as a service. And what I've seen be very successful within the four walls is when, again, you have predictability, you have the right inventory on hand, where you could go from a manual pick operation where maybe it's 35 units per hour, which is pretty traditional in a manual environment. And you could scale that up very rapidly to 150, 160 units per hour with the deployment of a robot solution where you could bring in extra robots to support you during peak season, and have seen that be very, very successful. Again, it's not something you could turn on in October, November. There has to be the proper planning and due diligence and how is technology all going to work together? But we've seen a lot of success on that front. And to Tony's point, I mean, relying on the labor market and temp labor market during peak season, there's just not enough human beings out there, and there's a lot of demand for them, and the cost for them is extremely high as well. So we've also seen some success with some gig worker adoption in the warehouse. But again, you have to make sure that you have systems and solution and an operation that's very easy to learn, so you could onboard quickly and get those teammates productive quickly. Nate or Rick, anything else you've seen you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I think look, the labor market is the labor market in a lot of these cities. And then especially once Amazon comes to town, a lot of 3PLs have a giant sucking sound out of them. And from this point, the best solution is, how do you use systems, processes, so that you don't rely on workers? I mean, I think Nate and I were discussing this during the UPS labor negotiations. Like the good news is that the Teamsters kind of quote unquote won. The bad news is that the Teamsters won. So from their point of view, you can win the battle and not win the war if UPS's biggest initiative outside of sort of healthcare and SMB is automation. So how can we use less people in the workforce? And that's really a multi-year initiative. And so I think UPS, you see them using RFID in their facilities to improve intake in particular, and parcels being on the wrong truck and not having to use tracer parcels through their network and things like this. But really, automation is the name of the game, and then that comes down to the right equipment, the right processes, and training of. You can't do it without people, but the key is to have processes and systems that ensure that you don't have to scale people linearly with your volume. That's really what has, I think, become the nirvana of supply chain.
Yeah, I love that. Nate, Do you have any thoughts or insight? Like, my experience is primarily in the four walls, right, and running an operation. But from from the carrier perspective, like, what's the influx of temp employees that they use to support all the extra volume during the holidays? And is that a challenge for them as well?
Well, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, at least the numbers that we see publicly. And I haven't seen it yet, to my knowledge. UPS, FedEx, the Postal Service will usually publish really large numbers of what they're hiring, to supplement their staff for peak season. And yes, that's a challenge, both just from an availability standpoint, expense, which they should have that relatively well forecasted, but then also just the execution, the performance of that temp labor. And that's where I think it comes into play too, is they're not as efficient, say from a driver standpoint, or other areas of the business too, handling to where that starts to be less efficient even than you've planned. And so that's where, whether it's availability and lower efficiency, it can become a challenge. One thing I would say, just kind of coming back to not just inside the four walls, but that's what makes me think of it. And also with carriers, a few that I know is actually, this is really obvious, but intentionally really investing in your core associates so that there isn't as much attrition, needing to backfill, needing to supplement. So there might be a higher kind of ongoing cost per unit from a labor standpoint, but then it's not as much of a need to churn through a lot of temp labor in peak season. So that's the other thing that I think I've learned from my prior experience, have some contacts in my network that they've made it a point to really, not just compensation, but benefits, and creating an environment that associates want to be in, to where they don't have to rely upon so much temp labor, during the critical peak period.
Yeah, that might be an obvious point, Rick, but the gap in like a great culture within operations, there's a lot of room for improvement there. So I think that's an awesome point. And that's another like 3-hour LinkedIn Live we could do on that one.
Highly variable too. Yeah. So.
Exactly.
Oh man. Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for a couple more questions that the team has ready to go. From Douglas, what are your thoughts on the position that FedEx announced, a 5.9% GRI that seems to have been well ahead of what UPS was ready for, knowing UPS has to absorb massive labor cost increases? Nate, we're going to tee that one up on a silver platter for you, buddy.
I mean, so the sequence, UPS usually waits regardless. I mean, that's to announce their GRI. I didn't come out and, boldly predict this. I thought it was going to be 5.9%. I can say that now. I just didn't think, regardless, that the market would bear another 6.9% increase. And I think both carriers knew that. So the fact that it's 5.9, I don't think is a surprise. Now, UPS's situation of the labor expense impact, it is to an extent front loaded. There's a large increase in the first 12 months. I still don't think it is an immediate knee-jerk, broad-based reaction that UPS needs to have from a pricing standpoint. They do a very, very good job of managing revenue, intra-agreement with customers. They're quite good at knowing where to be, and aggressive is a relative term here, but aggressive with pricing to either bring on new customers or retain the right ones in the right volume. And so I think being, maybe a little stingier on concessions in certain situations from the GRI, yes. But I don't think UPS has to react in a way that is something that they need to go recover this volume through purely pricing.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely a cat and mouse game being played here.
Yeah.
which is funny to watch because you have the entire world watching kind of USPS and FedEx pick off UPS volume ahead of the Teamsters agreement, trying to play up this drama. I think everyone knew from the beginning that UPS would not let a strike actually happen, but they had to play it out so they didn't really screw themselves over in the negotiations, which basically necessitates the fact that carriers need a backup plan. And so you need to sign a contract in the unlikely, like we just talked about Q4 planning, not having a carrier contract. That's a pretty important plan to ship any parcels. So I'm not surprised that FedEx wanted to seeing the market softness, wanting to put a little bit of pressure on UPS. I think still UPS is in a great long-term position. They're one of the only carriers that is actually investing in growth markets in a big way and winning more profitable business there. And FedEx has been more in reactive mode. Mm-hmm. So to me, this is more of a scoring some short-term points, potentially with not the most profitable customers even.
Yep.
Where UPS, I think, is a little bit more strategic, like doesn't want every customer back, even. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. Or not at the price at which they left, maybe. Or
right.
No, it's a good point, Rick. I think there much has been made, which it wasn't small. The amount of volume that UPS mentioned, it was 1 million packages average daily volume. So that's not insignificant, like 5% of, roughly of their domestic volume. I think they'll get it back. They're confident they'll get it back in pretty short order. I think it was end of the calendar year, but that might be a little bit, aggressive. But and Rick, you described it of customers were just being diligent about making the right decision for their business. It's not, I don't believe, this thing where everybody hates UPS that left. Like, that's not the case. Right. So I do think some of those customers have already gone back probably, but will in some way, and UPS will price it accordingly, or they won't have that volume back at their discretion. I mean, and so I do think that UPS, I agree, is in a better long-term position. Yes, there will be some margin pressure in the next, say, 3 quarters, but I think, I don't think they'll have to react too quickly.
Yeah. And especially in a business right now where efficiency is the name of the game. Like, who do you think has been investing in efficiency for longer?
Yep.
I think it's UPS and FedEx has just been more like, let's shutter facilities, let's mothball planes. That's been the strategy. And if you listen to the UPS plans, they're doing some of that 100%. Now, I don't think anyone's saying they're not, but they're also investing in mistakes, reducing hours, improving missed shipments, improving the facility performance. And you hear those same things coming out of like Walmart too, which is actually interesting, like from a supply chain point of view, with their automated FCs.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Great points, gents. Let's see. Do we have time for one more question? Let's see if here we go. Are you aware of strategies that LM delivery gig platforms like Amazon Flex, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber, and Spark are adopting to capture folks the same supply pool in the geographies they compete in? And how can smaller hyper-local LM platforms compete with the big players? Who wants to tackle that one first?
That's a good question. I could only guess at this one. I'm not sure I could even answer this one.
I don't believe I can either.
Yeah, it's a little early innings here, so I think we'll see how this unfolds. I mean, I could tell you from like the opposite end, on the operational side, like years ago, there have been some pretty cool platforms for the gig workforce to try to help. I don't think any has captured, mass adoption or really broken out like we had thought would happen. So I think it's early, and I think probably time will tell, and maybe the next time we get together, we'll give this some more thought and see if we could answer it.
Yeah. Look, any gig worker you talk to is always on 3 to 4 platforms. So yeah. I think there are hardly any that are exclusive unless they're like, an Amazon DSP, and Amazon's giving enough volume for their routes every day or something like that. But hyperlocal LM platforms, it's not necessarily competition. I think it's more like the strategy has to focus on the workers themselves and being where the big, like anytime you're a niche player, you have to be where the big players are not. And so you need to be able to fill workers' time when they're not used with the other players, or else you're probably not going to be able to promise them anything that's all that interesting.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, listen, gentlemen, I want to thank you guys very much for your time. It's been a great conversation. Again, for those listening, the one or two of you out there that have not are not following Nate or Rick and Rick's Watson Weekly podcast, great source of information. Nate always providing huge value and great assets and information on LinkedIn as well. And again, would love for everyone to take a listen to the eCom Logistics podcast, where both Nate and Rick have been guests. So you could check out their past episodes as well. This has been fun. Really appreciate all the audience participation. We look forward to doing this again very soon. We're planning on doing this, doing another LinkedIn Live session in January, where we could take a look back on peak season 2023 and give our thoughts on what the outlook for 2024 looks like. So again, thank you everyone who's listened. Thank you again, Nate and Rick, and wish everyone a great day. Thanks everyone.
All right, thanks, Dan.
Hi, I'm Ninad Acharya, CEO and co-founder of Fulfillment IQ, and I'm here with
Dan Call, CRO and partner at Fulfillment IQ. We're the team behind the eCom Logistics podcast. Our mission is to provide you with genuine insights from our work alongside logistics leaders to help you improve your supply chain.
In the eCom Logistics podcast, we share the knowledge and the insights we've gained from working alongside amazing brands, retailers, 3PLs, and VCs, so you can make the most out of your supply chain journey.
If you like what you're hearing, we'd truly appreciate your support with a 5-star rating on your favorite podcasting channel. Your feedback not only keeps us going, but also helps others find the podcast. If you think Fulfillment IQ can assist you, or if you have an idea related to logistics, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat and ready to explore new possibilities together.
Stay tuned to the eCom Logistics podcast on your favorite podcast platform for fresh and practical insights into e-commerce and logistics. Until next time, let's keep making a difference in logistics together.